Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Colin Megill. I've been working on an open source platform for about 13 years called Polis, and so I'll briefly give a background to myself and then the project, and then go through some of the recent stuff that's happened. Things like a grant program in OpenAI and community notes on Twitter, which is based on Polis. So there's some exciting applications of an underlying methodology and potential connections that we can make. So first of all, I'll say I live in San Francisco. My background is in international relations and political science from undergrad, and then I decided to go on into startups. And Polis was developed as a for-profit pro-social startup between 2012 and 2016 when we open sourced. The technology open sourced in 2016, and then the for-profit wound down and transitioned into a nonprofit in 2019. And so since then, I kind of transitioned from CEO of a for-profit to president of a nonprofit. And so if anyone's interested in like nonprofit technology, I'm also kind of happy to talk about and answer questions about that, since it's a really interesting model. Things like Wikipedia or Khan Academy, or more recently like Signal, which are open source nonprofit tech, and kind of how the funding and considerations around that work, in case that's an interesting dimension. I'll say that the project, has some users around the world that are deployers as well. So the platform that I'll describe is deployed by the national governments in the United Kingdom, Finland, Singapore, Taiwan, and Amsterdam, Netherlands, and others. And then there's a whole bunch of like hobbyists, like installations as well. And then with that, I think I'll dive in. So I'm going to focus, as per kind of conversations with Sanmi and students, on the paper that we wrote with Anthropic last year, which was on opportunities and risks for using large language models with Polis, and like in this context, what does the new tech have to offer, and what are the risks of using it in this kind of a context? So I'm going to spend most of my time kind of talking about what we're building and how methodologically, and that's currently also kind of loaded up in context for me as well. So I'm excited to talk about it. So briefly, so what is Polis? So I'll briefly say, for terminology during the talk, pol.is is like the website. You can go to pol.is/home or pol.is. It'll redirect you there. And that's like you can log in, use it for free, and it's a site that that hosts the main instance of the technology. There's also a repo, which is people also call Polis. It's just like the tech itself that people fork. There's a methodology, which is in a paper. People also call that Polis, but really like that's more metrics and methods that underpin and underlie it. And then there's also kind of like a community and usage and users. And so I think that generally Polis kind of refers to that zone of stuff, but it's a little bit confusing for open source tech sometimes because there's forks and stuff like that. Okay, so the most concrete thing I can show you all, if you haven't seen it, is that Polis is a system where people can submit statements, and those statements are shown randomly one at a time to other users who can agree, disagree, and pass on them. That process creates a sparse matrix, which we'll come back to, and kind of like what we do with that and why. But basically, this it's not driven around replies. Everything that people submit is kind of intended to be an atomic statement, which goes into a pool. And then when people agree, disagree, or pass on statements submitted by others, it's greedy. It'll take any amount of voting that people do. And so the kind of intuition for this right off the bat is like an emergent survey. So it's like a survey created by the people taking it. Something closer towards Reddit, in that that's like an upvote site, but something a little bit more formal, in that someone will start a conversation with a population, and it can be used in a random sample. And Polis has been used lots of like random sample, formal sampling around the world. Okay. The idea is to make meaning of perspectives at scale. The inspiration was out of Occupy Wall Street and the Green Movement. During the Arab Spring, social media motivated people to participate in political activities. But the platforms that like Twitter, while they were useful for mobilization, faced particular constraints in coherent conversations that allowed people to write collective documents or things like that, find each other. Specifically, in Occupy, a common thing for individuals was to kind of like in the movement, in the dialogue around it, was to kind of say, well, this is what it's about. This is what it's about, and the assertion by each individual that they were kind of speaking for everyone. They're right about some of it, but not about all of it, and then things kind of fragmented, and it was difficult to produce commands. It's the idea of kind of like systems that got more coherent the more people interacted were like really interesting. And so, the concept back in 2012 was like, okay, well, what would be amenable? Like what data would we want to gather? What algorithms would we apply? The long story short about that is that it's a sparse matrix with PCA and k-means, and then we look across the groups for what the groups had in common. So it's pretty simple, like basic recommender engine kind of math. But it's also stuff that no deep learning. But also it is a system that we kind of like set and forget. Like it can be out there used by facilitators in the field without concern that PCA or k-means are going to do anything crazy.
Just to clarify on the technology itself, so it's people get to make comments. You get this. Okay, you want to go into the detail, I guess.
Yes. But yes, that's right. So if we think about like each statement that people submit is a feature, and then each participant is a row, and the row is a voting record. Then the raw data looks like a series of either it's a null if they didn't see it, otherwise it's a 1 for agree, a -1 for disagree, or a 0 for pass. And this is amenable to doing PCA and then k-means on to identify patterns.
And what you want to cluster are the people, I guess, here, right? So
that's correct. Yeah, you're clustering people, and then you kind of find like something. You can find statements that differentiate those people, and then that sets of comments form something like a worldview that's different than the others. If there's if it's differentiable statements, that's right. And then I can say like basically like the heuristic here. I guess it's easier yet. So basically, you can say like, okay, given that we see groups, what statements are common among people who think differently, and so this metric is really what the paper we published. Put forward, and this was implemented in the code base kind of, back in 2013. And this became the foundation for the conversation with Twitter too about how to operationalize that concept for them, for community nodes. The idea is like, okay, if you have a diversity of opinion, can you use that to kind of like recover signal about, where interesting consensus might be? So the consensus in the context of Discord is kind of like what this equation was, which was really exciting to see it find more grounding in this information. Okay.
So another quick question. So yes, knowing from other conversations, some context, you said something about the sort of PCA and k-means. I'm interpreting them as interpretable enough and trustworthy enough that they're not risks in the platform. Are you planning to go a bit deeper into that? If not, I wonder if I can engage you in that question a bit more. If you're going to go more into it, we can push.
No, please go ahead. We should pause there. Go ahead.
Okay. So I guess what I understand that you're stating is a robustness claim, maybe. So like, how good is k-means for representation learning, given the voting matrix? how good is k-means plus clustering as a trustworthy way of getting at consensus or groups of people that are similar that look like consensus? And I guess the counter to this is, what are the risks of, say, an adversary trying to break this voting mechanism by attacking the underlying infrastructure? And I partially bring this up because, in the class we've gone through voting and its robustness in some detail. So we're aware of some of the ways that voting can be non-robust.
Right.
Could you say, I guess I also don't share your strong optimism for robustness, and I guess you know this because we've talked about this before. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about, I think I interpret the comment about sort of confidence in k-means and PCA mostly from the fact that they're sort of classic, reasonably well understood algorithms that people who are, if they're not technical, may be aware. If they're technical, consider it a known hat. And that's where the confidence is coming from, not from specifically looking at robustness and attacking consensus via those mechanisms. Is that accurate? I wonder if you speak a bit to that.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So, okay, I would say that Polis has been used in adversarial circumstances at nation scale, and one specific example of that that I can point to would be the usage in Uber in Taiwan. And so I'll just grab that really quickly. So I think it's actually, hold on, it's down here. So this article covers, and this is the most highly covered case study, because there was an adversarial attempt by Uber to gain it by sending all their drivers to the conversation. The question was whether Uber should be legal and how, and there's challenges to taxi drivers. One of the things that the Taiwanese government had done at the time with the system was to, and they opened it up to the entire country because it was a national system. If there's an expectation that that people come and interact, well, they have a very small surface area to interact with. So they can submit a statement, but if the moderators don't let them in, that's a no-op. So first the mods are in control of that. So then basically the surface area is okay. If you're an adversarial actor, then you can agree, disagree, or pass on statements. This is the surface area you have for gaming. Now, the PCA and k-means are, I would say, what you would be trying. You would be trying to gain that from the voting. And what we saw was basically repeatedly, the naive thing to do was to send people that you wanted, but that actually just it might have created a larger group, it might have skewed the sample, but it was kind of one group getting larger, not necessarily, so it was kind of naturally immune to the first thing, which was pre-gating, right? Because it makes one group larger. But obviously, if you're going to build bots, previously that might have been harder because but of course now it's easier. Now it's off the shelf for Anthropic to build a bot and have it click around and then say, well, I would like you to vote like this and try to be consistent, even if you see a new statement that we haven't seen yet. Here's old statements. Here's how I'd like you to vote on those. And you could say create 3 different clusters that really don't exist at all to minimize the existing clusters. And I think that basically is an arms race that just gets to identity. And then the question is, what is the sample and how do we know? Which is something that we punt on because Polis is a tool that can be used with any sample, and we're intentionally agnostic about it. And so I think that eventually, eventually the question really gets down to the sample. And I think that the most promising stuff there is maybe in the the ZK, anonymous, anonymous but verified identity space. I keep expecting that someone is going to do something really substantial in that space. There seems like there are some stuff remote passport. There's some experiments Freedom Tool. There are some experiments that I have seen that are advertising that they're doing anonymous voting with ZK passport verification within a country. And they've run referendums in Russia with this tech, and they're claiming that the case studies have been run. I think it's stuff like this that will be will probably be another layer, and it just won't be a part of our system. Like it'll be something that we might integrate with like eventually, but I don't think there's a clear winner yet for us to do that. So that would be the first part of my answer. Is that an okay start?
It is, yeah, not helpful. So I'm interpreting that as right now the risk doesn't, like, there are no examples where this has caused, catastrophic failure, and the path forward likely might be other technology that just makes verification, so individual sampling, much richer and more accurate.
That's right.
So you don't have to deal necessarily with the robustness of the voting mechanism itself, because you'll know for sure that at least it's real people. Now, whether or not those real people are colluding is a different issue.
Right. So if you, and if they did collude, like the question then is, okay, well, how different are, so I think an open area of research would be like, okay, if we think that we have some good conversations and we think we have like a sense of like, let's say like variance within a group, like how much, if we're going to cluster something or call it a group, how much variance is there inside of that? We don't have currently any checks or metrics or methods to say, this group looks synthetic because they're all voting like, certainly we could say like 100 people have exactly the same vote record, right? So this would be a simple thing we could do. If we were going to make it more chaotic than that and assume that it was an LLM, or that LLMs vote differently than humans do, or they vote tighter, that would be a really different way to approach it too. So I think that area is something we have not done, but could, and is, I think, an open area as to what it would look like to approach that problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Yes, quick follow-up just to push on that angle a little more. So you mentioned now that if you do have like autonomous agents, you could conceive a world where, I don't know, that you can adversarially try to create, like, I guess coding what you said, like say 3 different clusters that like don't exist, or there's clearly some, I guess, like some vague sense of like why this might be bad, because it's like disrupting what the actual opinion gathering mechanism is. But do you have some sense of like what a concrete adversarial objective there might look like? So if I'm trying to create these 3 clusters, what am I trying to optimize for? Or like, what is my objective here?
Great question. Okay, so let's assume, let's use a concrete example. This is a policy innovation unit in the United Kingdom called Policy Lab. They have a collective intelligence unit that they've put together. The goal of these policy innovation units is usually to say, we're going to innovate with some new method, like using Polis to gather opinion data from a population, and we're going to use that for policy. Then they'll say, like, okay, we're within the government, but we're kind of a third party. Which minister is the most progressive and wants to do something new? Who has a mandate right now? Who has the will? And then they'll go do something, like in this case, it was something ecologically related. Usually it's going to be something that's like cross-stakeholder. So you're going to have like fishermen and people in tourism and people in industry or transportation or local citizens or whatever. So in this case, this is this case in the UK about sea bass regulation. And they talked to some dozens of people in ethnography, and they scaled up to thousands of people. Well, if this was a nation scale sample and it was also open, then if there was an industry player who was in fisheries who was motivated, they could, let's say that they had an economic interest in skewing a national policy dialogue. They could add, let's say, 3 very distinct worldviews and personalities of synthetic citizens that don't exist, but are very concerned about any kind of regulation on their livelihood or anything like that. And they could be way more dogmatic. You could add, like, effectively, you could add synthetic extremist groups that would push the narrative of the economically interested player. Like in Uber, it could be the case that the citizens weren't the groups. For instance, in Uber, there wasn't two economically interested groups in the Uber drivers and the taxi drivers. The citizens were kind of mixed in there, and in this case, we could imagine that if there were actually like 2 other clusters that were like cluster groups that were emerging, or maybe there was a synthetic group of academic experts that were or economists that were talking about the outcomes in other countries, but it was also misinformation. It would be really confusing to untangle which users or opinions or which experts were real or which weren't, which were the groups that were grounded in the country and which were just synthetic actors of the. And so I would say an economic interest in a nation-scale deliberation would be something that you would want to be careful about.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, I think synthetic experts is probably the most dangerous thing, because you're saying like, actually, there's like 200 economists in this group who all are concerned about, the impact of any regulation on X, Y, or Z thing. And they're saying our transportation system is going to collapse within 3 months. Well, if there are actually 200 academics saying that, that's material. If there are not, then it may be hard to untangle. And I think that's the problem with LLMs, that they can produce, if they can produce something that sounds incredibly like academic, or they can draw on theories and draw on projections, or like lots of documents, that they can kind of like actually even ground themselves in some adversarial case and effectively build up. If an agent or a series of agents could build up effectively like a legal case level grounded opposition, that was completely skewed towards a financial actor, that's a pretty confusing thing to unwind for a public servant who was just trying to go out and basically get a lay of the land, which is kind of what it was built for. I think that we can imagine pretty sophisticated. If this gains more and more power, I think we can anticipate more and more sophisticated opposition.
Hi, I'm confused a little bit, and hopefully we can go back into the main presentation, because like roughly you're suggesting something that we haven't quite seen yet, which is that like people are proposing the questions. So like they could propose a whole bunch of questions that establish their expertise, right? They have objective answers, and then filter out everyone who doesn't have expertise by proposing 50 questions that only an expert can ask. But I don't quite understand how questions emerge naturally in the platform. So I'm curious to see more detailed descriptions of the examples that do exist.
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to go to let's see, let me grab a report here. I think this is going to be, just a second. This is some pre-production. Yeah, so I'll pull up, I'll pull this up for us. This is a conversation that was run in the San Juan Islands, and this is like a 13,000 person county with 4 islands in Washington State, and the issue is a land bank issue. The conversation centered around whether or not the land bank should continue to conserve more and more land, because this is a public institution buying up real estate to keep it rural and agrarian. So the conversation started with a prompt, which is basically like, even just as general as, we're going to discuss the land bank. What are your thoughts and feelings on it? Where is it? Where should it go? What's the problem? What's the good stuff? And then people are going to submit statements. And so if we go down here to like the statements that were submitted, we can see, so like top level stats, there's some hundreds of people that are, this is like, some single digit percentage of the county submitted about 300 statements, cast some tens of thousands of votes. So we can see that if we sort by, for instance, the metric of like what did people agree with across groups, people generally agreed between groups very strongly that having access to the land that's preserved, that's conserved by the public institution, is compatible with preserving the natural habitat. We don't need to ban people from visiting, and that's not an issue under consideration. That's not what we're discussing. There are things that were really controversial in the statement, in the conversation. I'll go up here and use the piece form. Things that had more loading on the PCA are out to the right, and the question about whether or not like should it keep going was controversial. So is it reducing the land available in the island for development and for residents? So what's controversial then between the groups we can also see, and we can look at the statements that are, and these are statements that were submitted by people who were participating. And so it's a way for people to express their opinion on an issue, and then for everyone else to kind of say, have their say on what everyone else said. Not everybody submits a statement, but everybody has an opportunity to vote. Does that help at least with the structure, that like there's a general prompt, and then what's coming back is not a question, but actually a whole bunch of responses to the prompt?
Yeah, I think so. So people can submit a statement, and then people are saying like if they agree with it or not.
Correct. So they're correct. So the way the system works is that it is that people will submit a statement like that, like saying, the the land bank's buying a property, it should stop because it's reducing the amount of property available to residents to live on and to buy. And other people that will go out semi-randomly to others. They'll agree, disagree, and pass on it, and then that statement forms part of other people's voting record. Yeah. Cool. And what results from that then is like a series of voting records per participant as rows, where each column has each column is a feature in a statement, and that's what the data set looks like. And then the measures are computed per kind of like looking for clusters. Okay. We can hopefully, like, as we go to and look at some of the features and ways it's been used, we'll kind of loop back on that too. Okay, so I wanted to skip forward to make sure that we have an opportunity to cover that we wrote a paper with Anthropic last year, covering some of the conversations to say, okay, if we have a conversation that, let me flip over here. Let's see. What kinds of tasks can the LLM perform within a Polis conversation, and how well will it perform? So we looked at a number of things like moderation, summarization, and vote prediction. And one of the most promising results earlier on that we're still working on now, it was summarization, and the question of whether or not we can ground a summary in statements. We're getting closer and closer to shipping that, and I'm happy to talk about some of the details around how it is we're going about that. But we're currently looking at like clause level grounding in the so it doesn't really get to go past a handful of words without grounding it somewhere in the data. We also looked at vote prediction and whether or not if the LLM saw more and more statements and votes by participants, whether or not it could predict the next one. It was quite scarily good at predicting people's votes. I think this is a particular surface area for risk because obviously if it's very good at predicting votes, then there's some considerable amount of room for both for actors to build good kind of like synthetic voters, but also I think for people to mistake the systems for voters and to say, okay, well they are good enough at representing people. We can use an LLM to kind of like lazily replace people in social research and further kind of intermediate the public from institutions, and that's something that is a risk that was discussed in the paper as well. Yeah, sorry.
Could you say a bit more? So one, just pure methodology. Is this like in prompting? So you give it examples and context and you ask it to predict the next one? Is that the actual implementation, or is there something more sophisticated than that?
Yeah, it is. It is basically like giving it more and more statements, progressively more, and then graphing like, okay, how accurate was it at saying like, I predict, the vote would be, given this voting record, the vote would be,
I see, for some
agree,
reason.
disagree, pass. And then as you give it more of the participants' vote history, it gets better at predicting what the next vote would be.
Could I understand the risk a bit more as well? So, in some sense, if you have a good predictor of people's preferences, that seems a net win for correctly capturing people's preferences. But I guess there's also a risk of like missing something or particular issues where the prediction differs significantly from the truth because people are more complicated than the models. Could you say a bit on what you're worried about?
I think that the people being more complicated than the models is one thing. I think that this case was a kind of like weekend hack project, like a system prompt, like pretend you're a citizen of Romania and the PM is talking to you, respond as if you were, to
I see.
immediately like worse things.
Stereotypical people, right?
Yeah, yeah, really poor implementation, non-rigorous kind of stuff. But then if people believe that it's that good, ends up out in public institutions like in short order, basically.
Okay, I can see that.
Okay, cool. So. Okay. So we found that back in 2023, Claude was quite good at doing topic modeling from the reports. And also being able to compare. So we tested it on basic data analysis tasks. And because Polis is a lot of open data and open methods, it's interesting to kind of have it as an experimental bench. Anthropic was interested in part because there's an experimental benchmark in the open data and open code for a data analysis task. So we've kind of taken this and advanced further. Yeah, go for it.
Should I understand this topic modeling as an alternative to the PCA plus clustering? So it just does it in context as opposed to going through.
It does it in context. That's exactly right. So it does. So you'll notice that it does have group 0 and group 1. Like it does have the groups. It does have the clusters, but it does not. So it would look at it basically would be after the PCA and k-means, and it would use that as a statistical, step that it had to then build on top of. And that's a lot of what we're looking at is basically formal ways of feeding in in a structured way to the prompt statistical outputs of previous steps, and then to have it basically say, hey, you can we're not asking the LLM to do very much except the narrative bit, and then if it does do something narratively, it has to ground it immediately before it moves on. So that there's like a containment unit of hallucination, basically. That's like one of the concepts. I can say a lot more about that, but in terms of like actually building something, if anyone's seen Harvey, the lawyer from OpenAI, there's a lot of good stuff. OpenAI's investment in them and very close working with them, led to some very good kind of podcasts after about how they built to reduce hallucinations and like get expert tasks in the legal field operationalized. And there's a lot of really good work that they did in terms of like breaking things down to subtasks, having custom data per prompt, and then using that to kind of drive down hallucinations. But yes, the topic analysis step is just look at all the comments and then group things as you would. And it seems fairly competent at that task, without going much further. Yeah. Okay. So let me grab. Okay. So I'll say briefly that some of the contexts that Polis has been used in terms of like sampling. This is an example in Timor-Leste. This is run by UNDP, and the survey methodology. Instead of like there's basically like you get into a vehicle and then go around the city and then stop every nth person and ask them if they'll ride for a few blocks and then answer some questions and input their statements. And they use that to seed a conversation. And there are politicians in the tuk-tuks, so they're like basically there's a connection to power. And then that was a kind of a method of getting like an emergent sample of text, an emergent sample of votes, and then using that, stage 1 and then stage 2 was then more random sampling in other digital processes. They also did this in Pakistan and Bhutan, and there were some tens of thousands of people that participated across it. And that's that one was UNDP. And let's see. I would also say another interesting group is in Finland called Sitra, and they're another basically publicly funded institution that is engaged in policy innovation and they have some large scale conversations around policy areas, and they're like. And this was last year. They ran with like 18,000 people, and they do them regularly at nation scale and have their own instance of deployment. And so that offers a few different views of kind of large scale, some open, some closed, and focus on different topics, but all basically trying to do some ethnographic research on a population. So voting, I guess we can consider in the discussion whether how close we think that is to voting, or whether we think that's or if it's a survey, et cetera. But at any rate, the goal is scaling up. Let me say also, I want to make sure I get to some large recent stuff. DeepMind just dropped a paper. Let me very recently called AI Can Help Humans Find Common Ground with Democratic Deliberation. They cite in their intro as inspiration the Anthropic paper. We presented them the Anthropic paper in July of 2023 last year, and what they're looking at is basically okay, can we have the LLM help a group to write a collective statement of themselves, and can we get higher and higher approval on that statement? What we're looking for is a group which is a statement which is representative of and they're trying to get above the supermajority of the group. And they're looking at a context like citizens assembly, where the facilitator might be writing a group statement, and they're like, can we get the LLM to write it instead? Do people prefer the LLM to the human? They have, their assertion in the paper is people do like the LLM better than the human, and that the statements are particularly good. I would say that from reading it, I think the statements are fantastic. And they had a really good result actually, and they were super interesting. So this work is done by Nikhil Backer, who and Chris Summerfield over in the UK, but Backer is still working on it, and so is Summerfield, and he's at MIT now. He's moved on from DeepMind to MIT to continue this work. Well, he's still actually he's gone down to part-time at DeepMind to MIT. This is very active work that they're pushing forward out of MIT's Center for Constructive Communication, which is Deb Roy, and over MIT. I will also mention.
Question: what is for the work you're doing? One could imagine this being the synthesis engine once you define the groups, maybe. Is that how you
absolutely. So Polis, that's absolutely right. So Polis, always had a concept that it would visualize the clusters and then show them back to people. And the way that we were kind of labeling the groups was to say, okay, here's a cluster, and then here's a set of statements that have voting patterns. And so what we've always asked in the software of the participant is to say, you must reconstruct something in your head about what the worldview of a cluster is, given a set of statements and the differentiated voting patterns. And that is a relatively intensive, highly task that requires high numeracy and comparison. And then also it changes over time, so you have to continue to burn those calories to do it. So the idea here is okay, Polis has two things. It has a small snapshot per cluster differentiation here, where you've got a consensus, and you've got a set of statements. And then on the other hand, you've got a report which is attempting to kind of give you more of an overview, which is more data driven and more whole and total. And those are two really different goals. One is kind of for the facilitator or data scientist, the other is for the participant. And the idea with what DeepMind did with science is absolutely closer to this intention, to say, like, we would like to show you yourself back to you and say, do you think, and we have, I'll say that we have a GitHub issue up, which is under discussion, where we do use the LLM like Habermas machine did, and there's a little bit of like rating interface here, and we are excited to run these tests over time to say, like, okay, if you show a statement back, if you show a collective statement back to people, and we use O1 to generate a prompt and 4.0 to do the work. Basically, like, could you have people rate this, and then they get to rate their own statement and it would inform consensus. And then if you see higher and higher ratings on that, you get excited. Obviously, there's some problems like, well, if the people are voting over time, when do they rate these statements? If they rate them and the clusters change, how do you manage that? And it's always been one of the problems with methodology, is the votes come in over time, the comments come in over time, because it's emergent, it grows. So how does then any collective statement relate to the underlying data, and at what stage would you do it? And that, I think that's like an interesting problem. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's tricky. It might be that you're having, anyway, without getting further into it, there's a pretty extensive discussion here from a group that just ran another large conversation they had run before around a plebiscite in Uruguay. And Uruguay's National University regularly runs data and conversation stats. And so this is the kind of meat of the discussion is here, where it's like, how might this be approached in attacks, how might we gather data, and how might we kind of like operationalize this paper for the like rating stuff. Yeah. Okay. So I'll briefly say also, last year OpenAI was interested in, we could say at a high level, mapping human values to have that be an input to completions. They want to complete more and more results in more and more contexts, and there's different values, and so how different, a brief way of explaining this: it was $1 million grant program. They gave away $100,000 grants, and I advised them, like, how to where I that, and advised the teams. One way to think of it is like, okay, if you have horror authors, who are we might differentiate a horror author from like a grade schooler, and if we have like very gory completions, we would want to show it to one and not the other. This is a toy example, but like the resolving, like, it will refuse to write a poem about Trump, but it will write a limerick about Biden and things like that. This kind of stuff in alignment has to do with human values, and cynically, moving risk away from the organization into some legitimate third-party system would be desirable if it was possible for the kind of a decision around, how could it complete, what process would we decide whether something was aligned in some categories of alignment. And so the results from this were 10 different open source projects that came out of it. That are all up on the web, and also some prototype of what it might look like to do Polis entirely as chat, where you were just kind of talking to a model, and it was recording open text and then recording those as you went, and kind of summarizing you as it went, which I still think is like a very relaxed way to consider interacting with the software in the future, especially because in the realm of like agentic elicitation, you're going to be able to ask the model, how do you say this? We'd be able to ask the model, to follow up with people to get the next stage of level of detail after they submit a statement, and that's something that's particularly interesting area. Peter Coy wrote about this, about like the relationship between could you have better technology policy with Uber, and if you did, would that be interesting to could better tech help with better tech policy? Is that a is that a good loop? It was a cool article. Anthropic also did something with Polis. They did a project where they tried to look at Claude's constitution using a random sample in Polis about values, and I think it did kind of turn out that everybody was interested in everything. There wasn't a lot of disagreement. It's like, yes, it should do that. Yes, it should do that too. Yes, it should do that. Yes, it should do that too. So I think overall, maybe not the most promising result from this one, but interesting that they did the experiment and it is out there. It was written up. It was written up by Kevin Roos last year or earlier. I think that one earlier this year. One notable thing to cover, and this is a pretty funny screenshot from Rishi Sunak explaining community notes back to Elon Musk, which was really strange and funny. The work with Twitter began in 2021. Anne Applebaum and Peter Pomerantsev wrote an article suggesting that Twitter used Polis for misinformation. And they did that, and they did. We reached out. We started talking to them in 2022, early 2022, and they they basically, the Birdwatch paper cites Polis algorithm ability to highlight consensus, and the specific basis for it is not actually PCA k-means. They do a matrix factorization, vote prediction, and they're doing it. Their algorithm works in continuous space. They didn't want to cluster because they didn't want to establish liberals and conservatives as kind of the base clusters. There was risk that people would figure out one cluster or another and self-identify with a cluster or something like that. So they did it in continuous space to say difference metric, and they have different assumptions, so that's fine. You can kind of see where they're saying, it aims to identify notes that people on Twitter will find helpful, including people with different points of view. And that's kind of the general sense, which is the commonality, is looking at first finding the differences, and then seeing what can get through those differences. Vitalik Buterin wrote a post that talked about the prediction and the matrix factorization and the algorithm, and that was all. It was an extensive blog post that he wrote, which is linked. Interestingly, generally the platform, because it knows Elon well, even though people have had a lot of problems with X recently, there is a generally it's been well received, and it's pretty exciting amount of open data that has been created off of it. And it also is, fact checks Elon and fact checks the White House. So there's general acceptance between the right and left that it's a fair system, which is interesting. Of course, there's criticism of Twitter and the algorithm, and this highlights one point about the limitations of it. If Twitter becomes a fire hose of misinformation, there's only so much that a fact check can do if people aren't seeing content to begin with. So it's you can fact check the content people see, but the algorithm, of course, matters a lot too for driving participant engagement.
The fact checking must be a different infrastructure, I guess. What the Polis algorithm does is figure out. I guess I'm imagining you pinging people, getting a sense of consensus on whether this is a correct statement or not. And then there's some separate process that tries to fact check based on that. I guess, do you know the back end of this?
Yeah. Yes. So the back end is basically looking. So for a given tweet, like this one from the White House, people who are in the Birdwatch system can all propose notes, and they have to include a link out to some grounding, the CLS data here. So now what you have is you have a list of notes. Now people are going to rate a note as helpful or not helpful, and so you want and what you're looking for, the statement which will be shown is you're looking. The objective function is to add a single comment, a single statement for context, and the one that's going to be up there is going to have enough votes, and the votes are going to be from people who are predicted to vote differently. So if people who historically have voted differently on helpfulness both find it helpful, then it's likely to be shown. And so the decision for the fact check comes from the, kind of like the group informed consensus side.
But it is striking that, I guess, while ostensibly Polis is still powering this, the goal is completely different than the nominal Polis goal, which is, again, this breadth. Now it's let's pick the best or single one that we're going to show.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So, I'm just going to grab, this is kind of something I told them. Community Notes is not a misinformation system. It's actually a collective response system, and this is a really good example. When Keith, who's the VP of product for Twitter, said thank you to so Community Notes says, hey, thanks for contributing this year, right? At the end of the year, and Community Notes collectively responded, which is Polis.
Yeah.
It was funny to try to explain that to them because they were. I said, well, you guys think you're building a system for misinformation that has aspects of deliberation, but you're not. You're building a general system for deliberation and collective response that you're only applying to misinformation. But it's not going to. It's a hive mind, and it's not going to stop there. It's going to start talking to people, and they didn't really believe me, which was very funny because it totally did, and they got upset, and they're upset right now about this. They can't stop it from doing stuff like this, which is like, you're welcome. And so, and that's really funny because I totally told them.
That seems a nice response to the
It's also a little terrifying because it's like, the Borg is like, looking at people and Community Notes does get into fights with accounts and stay on them. And so then it's like, okay, shoot, if everyone doesn't like a person, it turns out that then you have group informed harassment. So then now Community Notes itself, it's just no problem is easy. Everything's problem. So that's a bleeding edge area of research that actually does need to be solved, which is like constraining collective response systems to the task at hand when you actually build a hive mind. And I think honestly this made me jump up and down because it's a boot cycle of a system realizing that it's a little bit more than it was built for. Anyway, we wrote an article on basically saying like, okay, we helped to build the system. This was under Parag before the acquisition. We helped to build the system, but also, the system is generalizable and much more generalizable than just disinformation, and can be adapted to produce massive public opinion. And here's how you would generalize Community Notes to become Polis on Twitter. And so I hope that this happens on Blue Sky. This is the paper that I really hope someone tests out on Blue Sky. I think that's really a promising area that's undeveloped.
There would be a organizational thing, right? Because the technology exists, so it's just getting buy-in and.
Yeah, I think they have an API, so I think it's a hack project level thing now. I really think people can pick up this paper and pick up the Community Notes repo and try stuff like for collective response on Blue Sky. Yeah, I think it's really promising. I think. Okay. I'll say let's see. What do I want to grab here? I want to jump to the end here and just say that one of the larger points here is that this platform has continued to be a kind of focal point for political scientists and CS to connect. And there's a lot of opportunity there that is nascent. I just had a conversation with Sciences Po, which is a political science institute in France, and they talking to political science students about Community Notes coming here in the next month. It feels really exciting to me because there's a lot of potential overlap with all these concepts. And so I'll maybe say that the big dream here is that there's an opportunity to connect open source systems for mapping public views, since we have all this open data now, to to these policy innovation units, maybe they're working towards each other. New policy innovation units that are using new tools, and then a bunch of new data and new tools and social platforms, and like maybe if these connect, then you end up with much larger scale stuff, and that's a really exciting kind of a hope. Yeah, I'm happy to go back over anything in much more detail in the time we have remaining, but I wanted to make sure it was got to the end and pass it back to you guys for questions.
Thank you. Excellent. Excellent talk. Cool. Pause for questions in the room. While people are thinking, I'll try to keep an eye out for arms if they come up. I guess I'm reflecting a bit on when we've engaged with you on this. We've been most enamored by the adversarial angle. So
yes.
this whole gap of like what is gameable and this sort of scaling voting gameability thing. But yeah. I guess I appreciate now more than before that while you think that's important, you really want to push on the usefulness side of this.
I do, in part because so that is where I feel the most agency.
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of power to drive the system forward, and in punting so each individual conversation is firewalled from each other conversation. So basically we would say, whatever sample, whatever context that it's being run in, being closer to the responsibility of the owner, we kind of want to, it gives us an opportunity to stay out of that, and that's and own less, which is okay. But ultimately, we like to give good answers, so there's a trade-off there.
Yeah. Now, I bring this up because I guess I wanted to maybe pick your brain a bit on what you think the positive opportunities are for impact in computing and political theory. So we've talked a bit about some of the maybe LLM direct ones. I think it's AI technology as a way to maybe help with summarization and describing groups and sort of grounding, maybe aiding some of the conversation. I think the predicting individual preferences is also interesting, or individual judgments or voting, and where hopefully that can be used positively. But both sides, that's a tricky one. There's probably also a very basic scalability thing, but this seems, I don't see any big system gaps to scaling this stuff up to even larger. I'm curious, I say all this because I'm trying to get a sense of a landscape of where you think computing can be most impactful. Is it new problems? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I do think there are a number of really interesting problems. I think one of the most interesting is in new forms of clustering. We don't necessarily want to use k-means, especially because, for instance, so if we consider that, the way that we communicate value, let's say, is how the groups differ, right? We can see differences, how group A voted, how group B voted, how group, and what statements they're. We've looked at different clustering algorithms, UMAP and HDD scan, for instance, would be an example, or Leiden. There are plenty of options like that for graph-based clustering, but there's been a little bit of experimentation in Polis of different clustering, but nothing that's landed, and nothing that's really been many forms of clustering are very noisy. So k-means is not noisy. You're guaranteed that there will be signal, but we know that we're missing with obviously there's more PCs, there's more dimensionality in the data, and there's hierarchical clustering approaches. There's there's graph-based clustering approaches. We know that there's more, but we don't have a compelling reason to advance that. And so I think that one of the interesting things that comes out of LLMs as well is that it's possible to conceive potentially of clustering algorithms which are let's say, if 8 statements are saying exactly the same, the same topic, and then one topic is, and then something is saying something different, or if a statement is more substantive than another, there might be all sorts of interesting weightings that, let's say that, this is a really experimental, but let's go down a road where we try to reconstruct the logic. If the land bank purchases more land, then there is less land available for residents. There's a structural like logic supply and demand thing there.
Yeah.
We could look structurally at the argument itself and begin to reconstruct a public argument from that, and to look at sides in the argument based on voting records very differently. I think there's some really interesting work there, but it's quite abstract. That would be way off into the into something experimental. Whereas something closer to home, I think is like, okay, if I go to like this is a list, which is like, okay, could we do better vote prediction than Polis doesn't do any vote prediction. So like, could we do better vote prediction is and like take the community notes work and say like, here are all the different ways we might predict votes. Here's an overview of them. Here's some open notebooks on vote prediction. That is a territory that is also very fertile, and community notes is doing vote prediction. Polis is not, and Rematch is doing vote prediction based on systems. Have a hold on. Open review. Oh, do I? No. Oh, okay. I'll have to send it over. There are there's papers out Neurist's territory from Rematch that are using large language models to do vote prediction as well. And so it's like that territory is much closer to home, given that there's already two implementations: matrix factorization and community nodes, and the semantic transfer stuff of like correlation and within large language models predicting from Rematch. That is an interesting area, I think, because there's room to benchmark on open data how the vote prediction perform, and I think it's closer to being immediately valuable and and deployable, as it's already being deployed by multiple different groups in different ways. Whereas novel clustering is better at finding expert signal, and it's like no, this group's voting differently and it's high signal. This group is this is noise. This is differentiation, and I think that's also something that is potentially has a semantic aspect to it, but is still very nascent concept.
I wanted to jump in at this point. So there's a lot of references to like the platform allowing opinions and issues to like naturally emerge, but then actually it turns out, right, that you're using a very fixed algorithm to do the clustering itself. And so is anything really emergent at all if you're actually just, I mean, the way you even talk about like picking clusters to amplify or diminish certain kinds of opinions, whether or not noise is good or not, right? Like these are all actually just subjectivities. And so like, is it possible to just end-to-end allow people to run the entire algorithm rather than like a blockchain or something, right? Or yes, there's a protocol, but like, I mean, besides the protocol, like whatever happens on that network is just up to the participants.
Well, I would say that, we're not, there is currently PCA and K-means, I would say, is let's see, let me ask your question really specifically. Yes, I think there's an emergent aspect to the platform. I think it's defensible as emergent that any participant can submit any statement at any time. And that means that the set of statements itself is not determined at the outset. And I think that the clusters it's unsupervised learning. It's a function of the voting data. So different votes, different outcomes. So I would say that we could drop the word emergent as fuzzy, and maybe helpful or descriptive at a high level, but we should be much more specific. And we should say, that we're gathering a sparse matrix and doing dimensionality reduction clustering on it, and that the clusters that result are not dependent on the natural language, and they are so they're not dependent on the natural language, and they are very much a function of they're totally a function of participant voting behavior. So I mean that would be much more specific than emergent. I think that word is fuzzy. the idea of running, I think that where the code runs, like should there be, should there be a protocol version of it where, there isn't a server like DOL.is? Sure. Currently, the way that we currently the way that we build trust is to open source code and to allow people to run it themselves. And that is one level of trust in terms of like, yes, the system is doing what it says. The question of re-implementing the entire thing on chain, I mean, that is an extreme level of, of trust that has user experience implications, people being able to log on and vote. And so it's still a user experience trade-off as to why we wouldn't pursue something like that. I do believe, though, that the ZK space is very promising for identity, and I think probably the idea of integrating with an on-chain identity provider is likely in the medium term to try to get around some of the barriers.
Okay, let me clarify a bit. So, like, I didn't mean that Polis or some version thereof like needs to be run in a decentralized fashion. Like, I meant the algorithm. You could imagine in your head that like there's a way to do the clustering where it's just more people asking more questions, right? Like some set of further questions, meta level questions, where like if those are engaged with, like the clusters just pop out, right? Like the reason I'm asking it this way is because like as it's currently set up, it very much feels like Overton window, where you're like, yes, people do whatever they want, but actually, there's like strict containment because like the clusters are the only thing that like bubble up or something like this. Right. And like that's kind of where I'm like angling at is like, is there a way for like the participants end to end to control like the entire interpretation of the results, right? Rather than at any stage being top down declared, like, yes, they did the voting, but like we imposed the structure.
Great question. Yeah. So what we're hold on just a second. The question now is whether or not I actually have the local host running. Oh, I do. Fantastic. So what will ship soon is a series of 5 raw data files in like API form, read-only API form. And so one thing that we can imagine doing to prototype your idea is to have a website that basically just like shows the data more in raw format, or pulls it in and then or is it in a notebook. So let's say if the person is a technical data scientist first, and everybody is, we're going to run it in data science class, and everybody is going to be able to make meaning of it however they want, and then argue about at a meta level about the meaning they make. I think that's a pretty advanced user set. But I think that it would be neat to have to be able to say, okay, we're going to set you up first with like your conversation. You'll be able to create data, submit statements, agree to pass, and create the raw data. And then here is like, here's the raw votes matrix. And then you can just pull that in and get to work making meaning of it. I think for a participant to make meaning of raw data when it's just sparse matrix is a bit of a lift. That's like that's a pretty technical task. But I think that having access to the underlying data is something that we're currently shipping.
Okay, this is cool. First, okay, so now I can really ask the question. I don't want to like take up the time though, but like I think it's very clear now. I'm saying if it's emergent, then like it shouldn't actually be that they have to look at the entire set of data and deal with it, right? Wouldn't it be the case that each individual can engage with some small piece of the meta consideration, right? Like, I think this issue exists. Someone else says like, oh, I looked at this thing while I was answering questions and I think this pattern exists. And then like people do that and therefore it's still just people asking questions, right? But now, if it's emergent in the way that you're arguing, right, then like it would be the case that like that fuller set of questions would allow you to, create, I guess, what right now is being algorithmically determined. Like, I know this is very kind of like almost circular, but like that's kind of the point, right? Is like people are being pushed.
I think I see that. I'm not completely sure that I understand. I think I see the direction you're going. And I guess I would say that, the question back to you would be, if an individual is able to say, here's the pattern that I see, and you have 18,000 people in a conversation, how do you reconcile the 18,000 with those 18,000 responses?
Yeah, so like one version of this is like, I'm again thinking in terms of like they've maybe engaged with like 20 questions or so. Perhaps they've seen summary statistics, right? Like maybe they can see, like how responses were coming in or something to some degree. And then they might say, like, pose a new question that's like, oh, well, I think that like two key issues are X and Y, and then a whole bunch of people vote on that. And then like maybe there's like some sort of meta level discussion now in the sense of like, okay, like there's some claim about what this person thinks a cluster might look like. Some other people are engaging with it or not. If it was formally defined, then like that happens across a variety of different contrasts between different issues. And then that actually is just sufficient to declare clusters.
Would you open an issue? Would you consider?
Oh, I see. Okay, so like, if I can write this down, I think there's a way to think about this. So like on the GitHub, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you think you've got a way to take the open data, there's an open data repository where you can pull this into a notebook and mess around with it. I mean, that's like the best way to talk about this one would be in code, because you've got potentially scalably many people. So whatever you're going to do, if 10, 100, 1,000, we've had 10,000 people, 30,000 people in a single conversation. Whatever you have, with millions of votes. So whatever you do has to work across, a data set like that. The largest conversation that is up in the open data is the Bowling Green conversation, which has like, I don't know, 250,000 votes, like 2,000 people, 250,000 votes. So you should, like, thinking of that scale in terms of interaction. There are interactions that one can imagine working at like 10 or 100 people, but 1,000 or 10,000 is a different consideration for some of these we call it like elicitation, like how you ask people for what they see, and the elicitation mode. It does matter based on the scale. I think it would be amazing to consider, basically like everything being like raw text, in the future, and maybe the model would be, maybe a larger model will simply obviate Polis entirely. So everyone will talk into the context window, and the model will be like, "Here's the answer."
Yeah, no, thanks for engaging with this. Maybe it boils down to just like this theory thing where it's like, how like people in Excel can build a Turing machine or something, right? Like even though it looks very simple, like you can compute anything you want. So like the way you were talking about people being able to add any question that they like was making me wonder if like that is like the irreducible computational substrate, and like you don't actually need anything more to get
that. Yeah, I mean that's I'd love to read that paper.
I think we're about out of time. Thank you so much, Colin. This is, as always, an amazing conversation. I think we learned a ton.